Hello, everyone. My name is Athena, and I'm here to talk to you about the neural basis of consciousness. I have to say, I feel a bit nervous talking in front of a monitor. I would very much prefer to be there with you, but it is what it is. So we have to go with that. If I were there, I would have asked you what consciousness means to you. How would you define it? And I think we would soon realize together that each and every of us would have had different definitions about this intimate, subjective experience. But let's say that we all agreed that it has to do something with the brain. And here we will see how this subjective experience is supported by brain function. My personal journey with consciousness starts with the undergraduate studies, where I undertook some course on philosophy during my psychology studies, which later gave me the motivation to study neuropsychology and later do my PhD in biomedical sciences, studying patients with disorders of consciousness. So the field of neurology, where we studied extensively post-comatose conditions where patients arrived after sustaining severe brain injuries. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here, for example, we have the case. Let me also keep you some company. Here we have the case of Terry Shavo. That's a patient from the United States that occupied the headlines for a long time because after her cardiac arrest in 1990, she was declared as in vegetative state, which means that by definition, this state is characterized by loss of consciousness. And it recruited a lot of debates because her husband, based on her wishes, as he was claiming, wanted to limit her treatment, so to take away the feeding tube and let her die, whereas her parents disagreed, and they were in court for 7 years, up to the point that eventually she died after removing her feeding tube in 2005. So stories like that of Terry Shavo shows us that consciousness has real life implications, and for me, this is the ultimate motive to continue researching this amazing field of research. So in the bedside, the way we infer consciousness is by studying behavior, which means that we study motor responsiveness in order to induce and to infer cognitive capacities. So based on this, patients in coma, they are supposed to be unconscious because they don't open their eyes, they don't respond to any command, they don't even show awakenings after severe physical stimulations. But once they open up their eyes and still remain unresponsive, they do not show any signs of awareness, they're supposed to be in a vegetative, unresponsive state. Once they show some types of awareness, they are supposed to be in a minimally conscious state. Awareness here is defined as response to commands, like, for example, lift your finger or trace this object in front of you. These patients are also supposed, they are non-communicative, and they are also supposed to be with disorders of consciousness. And only when we have established a reliable way to communicate with these patients, which means a reliable way to have yes responses to and no responses that we know beforehand that they are reliable, we no longer find patients in disorders of consciousness, and now all the efforts are paid towards good recovery through rehabilitation treatment. But not everyone agrees with the guidelines, meaning that many people do not really agree about what vegetative unresponsive state is or minimally conscious state is. despite the general agreement. So there is an intuition that something is not really clear. And we quantified that with a wide survey across many countries in Europe, where we studied the opinions of medical professionals. So we asked them whether they find it acceptable to stop treatment in a chronic vegetative state and minimally conscious state. And we found that the agreement toward treatment limitation was mostly supported for the vegetative state, although we see that 66% is big, but still it was not like a unanimous agreement with that. Although people would agree less with treatment withdrawal in minimally conscious state. So in that case, the idea about having or not consciousness mediated the opinions of people about what they would have done in the case of these two conditions. But what was interesting is that when we asked the question in a different way, like whether would you like to be kept alive if you imagine yourself in an unresponsive vegetative state of minimally conscious, now the opinions were more unified in the sense like most of us would not like to be kept alive in these conditions because we think most probably that our lives would be severely restricted. Either this would mean to be in an unresponsive vegetative state or minimally conscious. And we also found that the opinions about treatment withdrawal were also mediated about the opinions of pain. So pain is an experience. So if we ascribe pain to somebody, like here, if we think that patients in unresponsive syndrome do experience pain, we would agree less with treatment withdrawal as compared to whether we think that these patients do not feel pain, so they don't have this experience. So with all this, I want to say that there are still ongoing debates as to what consciousness is in these patients. And we cannot always trust behavior in that sense. We quantified also that by the means of standardized assessment. So what we did, we studied patients that they arrived to University Hospital of Liège in a post-comatose state with a clinical diagnosis, 45 of them, the clinical diagnosis of vegetative state. And then we studied them with a more standardized tool, like here we see the coma recovery scale. And we found that 18 of them, when they were diagnosed with this standardized tool, they were in minimally conscious state. So 40%, they were misdiagnosed. So as behavior is not reliable all the time, it's the next logical step is to go study the brain. So here we can see the typical brain, a healthy brain of yours and mine, how it looks like if we cut it on the side. And here we have two cases where in one case we miss a big part, actually the whole cerebellum, the small brain of our heads, and another case of an older guy that was missing the frontal part of his brain was filled with air. So what is interesting with both cases is that these patients walked into the hospital because they were complaining of dizziness and headaches. So this suggests that we don't necessarily might need the whole brain to be conscious, but rather we need a brain that is functional, which means that we need the areas of our brain to talk to each other and to create something more than its parts. So here we can see sections of the brain here horizontally of different conscious states and how global metabolic levels look like. So brain metabolism here was quantified by means of PET scanning, which is a neuroimaging technique, imaging the neurons that they consume glucose on the premise that when we are doing something cognitively cognitively loaded, we need energy, and we get that from sugar. So we see here that the colors that they are toward the green and yellow scale, they are characterized they characterize neurons of high metabolic activity, and in purple of lower. And this would be a normal conscious state, which is in sharp contrast with what we see in brain death, an empty skull sign. There is no metabolic demand whatsoever. Similarly, in deep sleep and in general anesthesia, the metabolic levels go very, very low. And we see that they resume up to normal during REM sleep and when we recover from general anesthesia. So patients in unresponsive vegetative state, they show also reduced levels of neuronal activity. And in that case, we think that neuroimaging can help us quantify the level of consciousness in those severe restricted conditions. Here, I would like to show you how I have done so in the past years using another technique, functional MRI, which measures changes associated with blood flow. So in order to use fMRI, we can use it during different paradigms. We can use it, and we have done it during active paradigms. So in that case, we asked patients to imagine actively in their heads to do something like to play tennis or to go visit the rooms in their house. And we found that these two different tasks, they elicited very different brain activations in each and every healthy person. Here we see two patients actually that they modulated the brain activity according to the task, which matched what was found in healthy people. So here the tennis command elicited the supplementary motor area, for example. The visit of the room of the house, it elicited the parahippocampal place area, and this gives us good reasons to believe that the patients understood the task and they executed it. Interestingly though, this is a very demanding task. Patients can get exhausted very easily and get tired. So if we don't see any activation, we cannot say that the patient is not conscious. So we go down to have a more simpler paradigms, like passive paradigms, where we exert an external stimulation and we see how the brain reacts to this. Like here, we stimulated the median nerve of the wrist with electric shocks. And we found that here in the minimally conscious state, there was a widespread activation of the so-called pain matrix, where we see cingulate areas, somatosensory areas, thalami, and motor areas. The issue with the passive paradigms is that they can require complicated experimental setups. And in that case, hospitals and other centers, they cannot really execute such studies. That's why we need the simplest form of neuroimaging paradigm, which would be to rest our brains when we do nothing. Interestingly, when we do nothing, our brains still do something. Actually, it's very difficult to stop us from thinking. It's like we have a stream of thoughts. As William James put it, consciousness has a stream that characterizes a flow of ongoing mental activity, as the New Yorker had very nicely portrayed here, where a person looks at a piece of art and can make totally different dissociations as long as this person is onto the piece of art. So why shall we study this resting activity? How do we know that it is a piece of information? So first, let's check some numbers. The fact that is that the human brain is approximately 2% of the body's weight, and yet it consumes 80% of its energy. The body energy is spent on neuronal signaling. So most of the consumed energy is used for function. And it's interesting that it's only a surprisingly small percent, typically less than 5%, that this brain energy is spent on stimulus and performance epoch changes, which leads us to the conclusion that while conscious awareness is a low bandwidth phenomenon and therefore energetically inexpensive, It is dependent upon a very complex, dynamically organized, non-conscious state of the brain that is achieved at great expense. And this is exactly what we are studying here. The first ideas of a default mode function of the brain came from the observation that during task performance, we had systematically the activations of some specific areas of the brain. So here we can see how the posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus and mesiofrontal areas, how they show coordinated activity across time, as we see the bold signal change that it goes together. And we say that once these areas show these kind of correlations, they are said to be functionally connected. And in that case, we say that the brain has a default mode of function, and we have observed the famous default mode network, as we said before, encompassing posterior cingulate and mesiofrontal areas. And we study this network in disorders of consciousness. So we checked how its integrity looked like going from controls and the locked-in syndrome patients, which characterize patients that they are tetraplegic and unable to sometimes in the complete case of locked-in syndrome to communicate with the environment, but they are still conscious. So if we see across healthy people, minimally conscious state, vegetative unresponsive, and comatose patients, the connectivity of the default mode network was showing nonlinear decreases across the level of consciousness. Interestingly though, we also have some regions that they talk in an opposite way with the default mode network, the so-called DMN anticorrelations. So if we see here in yellow and in orange, the areas of the DMN, we see the time course of inferior parietal sulcus and frontal parietal areas that they go in the opposite direction. We were wondering then whether this functionality has something to say about the cognitive counterpart of ourselves. So we studied the DMN correlations and the anticorrelations. As we see here, it's another illustration across time, how they change their functionality. And we coined them with the notions of internal and external awareness. Internal awareness meaning that all these self-related activities that they happen when we do nothing, like mind wandering, like projection of our plans in the future, mental projection in the past, and so forth. And as external awareness, we coined the content of the anticorrelated network, meaning everything that we perceive through our senses. So we're interested in this functionality, and we did a study with healthy people where we asked them to sit in front of the computer with eyes closed. They had to put their fingers of both hands on a keyboard, and they had to close their eyes. So from time to time, they were hearing a beep that was an auditory prompt asking them to rate the level of their awareness, the external and internal, as it has been before the beep. And although this was kind of very subjective task, we found that at the group level, similar type of anticorrelated activity. So when people were saying, I'm not aware for or less aware for external awareness, they were saying that I'm more aware for internal awareness. So there was this anticorrelated and even switch between the external and internal on average every 20 seconds when we calculated. Then we put people in the scanner and we simplified the awareness scale. Now we asked them to rate their awareness from strongly external to strongly internal. And then we saw the areas that they were activated based on these responses. So what we found is that for strongly internal aware responses, we got the DMN, the default mode network. And when people were saying that they were mostly oriented externally, we found areas of the frontoparietal network. Then we wanted to kind of validate the assumptions we had about the functionality of this anticorrelated activity. So we try to now modulate the level of awareness and see what happens in the anticorrelations. So we were interested in arriving in a modified awareness state that would still be able to respond. And that we thought we could do it by means of hypnosis. So hypnosis was here induced by the anesthesiologist working at the agology department of the University Hospital of Liège. And she and her team are doing numerous operations under hypnosis where they induce a state of mind where people dissociate, they say that they are dissociated from their environment, and at the same time they were very absorbed into this condition. So they respond they're able to respond to operations with no pain. So we asked her to help us, and here we can see the ratings about different dimensions of hypnosis, like I said, of absorption, dissociation, and the external thoughts. During the 3 scans that we did, when people were normally conscious, when they were asked to revive a pleasant autobiographical memory, mostly that was vacations, let's say, and doing the same thing under hypnotic induction. So when we analyze the data, the fMRI data, we can see, we found that the DMN did not dramatically modulate any parts of it, but we found very interesting changes in the external network, external awareness network. So here we can see the functional connectivity, normal wakefulness, how the frontoparietal connectivity was persisting, the autobiographical mental imagery condition, and how in hypnosis it actually disappears. So these areas that we thought that they were corresponding to the perception of the external environment goes together with the fact that under hypnosis we tend to dissociate ourselves, as we see here, from the environment, and we tend to have less external thoughts during this condition as compared to the other 2 states. Another test we did was to account for the effect of wakefulness. In that case, we scanned people under propofol anesthesia, and we measured the connectivity of the DMN and the external network in this condition. So here we see in wakefulness the DMN, and here we can see and in wakefulness again the anticorrelations, how beautiful they are. Interestingly, under propofol anesthesia, the DMN, although it shows reduced connectivity values, it still persists, with more dramatic changes happening in the anticorrelated network. Another test we did for the anticorrelations had to do with the effect of the environment. And this was the funkiest experiment I have ever done, because we participate in a parabolic flight. So a parabolic flight happens once or twice, I think, a year, and we had the chance to participate in that in collaboration with the European Space Agency, where we were the actual guinea pigs. So what we did, we were in this aircraft that was flying over the Atlantic near to Bordeaux, and it did this maneuver, this parabolic maneuver. And what was happening is that after the plane was going up very, very fast, then it was in free fall. And during this free fall period, there was, we're experiencing microgravity, so we were floating. And we had to do that approximately 20 times. But let me give you an insight of what was happening. So we can see here how during this period we were experiencing the zero gravity. As you can see that we were very happy to float. That was not the case at the beginning, that it was very unpleasant sensation. So for 20 seconds we're experiencing microgravity, and we had to do that 30 times. And after we were exposed to this profound, amazing experience, we then went directly to the scanner and we scanned our brains. And then what we found, it was very interesting. We found that our brains before and after the flight, as we can see here, the pre-scan and the post-scan, showed some differences because that was such a profound experience to not to be anchored on by gravity on the ground. Our brains responded to that. And interestingly, it was actually the anticorrelations that they were mostly influenced. So we can see here the supramarginal gyri, how they were nicely anticorrelated in the pre-flight and how the anticorrelations were diminished after after the flight, post-flight. Another test we did was how the anticorrelations look like in pathology. So we tested patients in unresponsive wakefulness state, the vegetative state, minimally conscious, and those that they exited the minimally conscious and they were healthy in terms of consciousness and healthy people. So we see here the connectivity of the DMN correlations here in red. The DMN anticorrelations now, they happened to appear only in healthy people and the patients that exited the minimally conscious state. And in unconscious conditions, they did not only disappear, but they became positive to the DMN. So in other words, we have these two systems that they talk to each other, and somehow they reflect the realities around us about the content of consciousness, but also the level of consciousness. And this functionality tells us a lot about the ongoing activity, mental activity. Interestingly, though, our brain by default is characterized by many resting state networks. And like here, we can see that the first of them was the motor network, where we can see here motor areas that they are recruited during a motor task that was a finger tapping task, and how these areas are also recruited also by default when we do nothing. And in that case, we also had different types of systems, networks around the brain, either characterizing visual areas, like we have these networks. So I guess you realize how complex the visual system is to be needing to have so many networks. This is the classic DMN we had before. The cerebellum comes organized in a separate network. The frontoparietal now, it can also be seen as the left and the right. We have frontal eye fields, the auditory areas and motor areas. So the brain shows by default a way to organize itself in long range networks of a model content, and those are the systems that represent sensory related processes. When we checked how this system level organization appeared in patients, we checked these 10 networks, and we found that only 4 actually they showed dramatic changes across healthy people, patients in minimally conscious state, and unresponsive patients. So we see here the number of subjects showing the networks. So the networks that made the difference was the DMN, as we hypothesized at the beginning, the frontoparietal that now comes in 2 different systems, the left and the right. And interestingly, we also found the auditory system that was met significantly less often in unresponsive patients compared to MCS and healthy. By means of machine learning, we used a classifier to separate between healthy people and patients. And we found that we had an 85% of accuracy to separate these populations when we used as features the auditory network and the DMN. So these 2 networks were able to separate healthy people from patients with accurate high accuracy. And we have the first source of information at that point that this can be done, first of all, with resting acquisitions. And second, we have an impression of how this separation happens. So by that time, we said, okay, the DMN was part of our predictions, but the auditory network, how is that possible? Is it because we are exposed to the scanner noise by default and then this is captured somehow? Or is it something more intrinsic, more meaningful as that? We found that in our next investigation, where we wanted to answer to exactly this question, how and which network can separate, not this time between healthy people and patients, but between patients themselves. So which of these long-range networks and sensory networks could best discriminate minimally conscious from unresponsive patients? Can we do that by scanning the brains in resting conditions? So we estimated first the functional connectivity of these networks, and then what we did, we ordered the networks based on their ability to separate between MCS and unresponsive patients. So we found that the auditory network was one that separated these two classes with high accuracy, like 43 out of 5 patients were separated accurately. But we had a problem, methodological problem here. The problem we had here was that we used the regions of these networks as they were defined by the difference between MCS and VS as as features to separate the patients themselves. So it was kind of circular reasoning, and we wanted to avoid that. So what we did to solve this double dipping issue, we went to check how the highest network in separation of the two classes would behave in discriminating new patients, so unseen data. This is how the connectivity of the auditory network looked like. So we can see they had not only auditory regions, but also visual regions. So this cross-modality somehow was able to separate new patients scanned in collaboration centers in New York and in Austria. So out of these 22 new patients, were able to separate accurately 2, and only 2 cases they were showing misclassification issues. For us, that was very big news at that point, because we were going towards a very simple tool that required no mediation from patients or the doctors. So with a 10-minute scan, we were able to say whether somebody was in the class of minimally conscious state of unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. The added value of that, the scientific part, the scientific point of view, was this cross-talking between auditory and visual areas. And this cross-modality seems to support conscious processing, as it appeared more connected in the MCS as in the unresponsive state. So far I have shown you that resting state connectivity that is stationary, meaning that we aggregate all the signals across the acquisitions together, is linked to behavior and task performance, reflects physiological and pathological unconsciousness, and permits single patient automatic diagnosis, as I just showed you. But it remains unclear to what extent it provides a representative estimate of cognition. This is because ongoing interactions among distinct brain regions may be a more accurate means to capture this estimate of cognition. So indeed, like moving from stationary functional connectivity, we can see, as I said, how brain signals, when averaged together, relate to each other. So here we can see, we can imagine that each row and each column to be a region and how it talks to one to the other. So this is so-called a correlation matrix. Then we can have different ways to think, to look about this functional connectivity. We can check whether it's time varying, so we can use windows that we can move them across the acquisition and estimate the connectivity matrices across them, and checking how these changes across time. Or we can have a more dynamic exploration of the connectivity with autoregressive models. So when we talk about brain dynamics and cognition, here you can see that indeed our brain function is not stationary across time. We show coordinated, different coordinated activity across our brain areas. And this way of functioning has significance for performance, emotion, and cognition during typical wakefulness. What happens in unconscious state, it was found that in primates, for example, we show more rigid spatiotemporal organization and less metastable dynamics, as they are called. So in sleep, in anesthesia, in humans and animals, we can see that the brain regions among themselves, as we can see in the connectivity matrix, they don't talk much to each other. It's better here like that. So again, we can see in this scale that the connectivity across the areas is around 0. And when this happens, the brain cannot map the complexity of the internal and the external world. How would that correlation matrix across time would look like in disorders of consciousness? We recently showed that by putting a lot of data together, coming from different centers around the world. So what we found, we checked how the brain organizes itself across time. And we found that this is done by primarily 4 different ways. A pattern of signal coordination that is rich in the sense like here the different regions talk to each other in a very differential way, either positively or negatively. We can see here the coherence among the regions from -1 to 1. So we show anticorrelations and correlations. In sharp contrast with a pattern of signal coordination that shows no crosstalk across areas. As we can see, these are around 0. And we also have 2 patterns, that one primarily is driven by visual regions, another one where all areas talk to every other area in a positive way. So everything is connected to everything. We quantified then the chance that each of these patterns would have to appear in unresponsive, minimally conscious, and healthy people. So we found that the pattern 1, the rich pattern 1, had more chances to appear in the group of healthy controls and minimally conscious state patients, in contrast to pattern 4, where this very simple way of signal coordination was most likely to appear in unresponsive patients and patients in minimally conscious state, less than healthy people. The real dynamics, though, lied in how we explore one pattern over the other. And we did that by checking the transition probabilities from jumping from one pattern to the other. So we found that we had more chances to transition if we were in a higher conscious state. In that case, we can see here with black arrows that the more conscious we are, the more chances we have to re-enter this pattern, but also to jump to explore others that we don't stay for longer, as opposed as we see here in gray arrows, that the less conscious we are, we have more chances to re-enter and to explore this pattern, simple pattern 4, and we would not leave it for higher and more complex modes other than something similar, and we re-enter. In other words, with this study, we show that the conscious brain hosts the ability of change and flow. And when this is not possible and things remain stationary and stable and predictable, this is not an indication of consciousness, at least in humans. Why would that all matter after all? I want to go back to the initial question, essentially, like why we would go in such a long lengths in order to study brain function in disorders of consciousness. Well, as I said at the beginning, there is a real life application for these studies. So it's not only about discovering the scientific implication of consciousness, but we are dealing with pragmatism in many, many cases. So when it comes to clinics, the outcome of these tests are very, very important for clinical management. So when we run a test, a neuroimaging test like that, we have three scenarios, like whether brain activity that is shown on this test is less than a neurological examination. So there is a mismatch between the doctor and the test. When brain activity is higher than the neurological examination, and when the machine and the doctor agree to the same conclusion. And of course, this has different effects. Either sometimes they can be beneficial or harmful. In case, for example, where brain activity is less on this test than the neurological examination, it's a good thing for those relatives and families, because like that they facilitate their decision to limit life-sustaining treatment. On the other hand, some families may lose hope, purpose, and meaning in life if they realize that these tests they were done, they were not showing what they were expecting. Now, in case that brain activity is higher than the neurological examination, the good thing could be that the clinical management may be intensified, targeting the chance of further recovery. On the other hand, it can be that this is just an indication that is not indicative of a good outcome, and then relatives and families can hold false hope. Eventually, we'll have the scenario where the neurological examination and the results of the test match. And the good part of it is that clinicians and relatives may be now able to affirm in their decision about the level of treatment. Whereas on the downside, clinicians and relatives may be disappointed and treatment cost effectiveness may be poor. Quality of life in that case can be highly relevant and can be also influenced. Now, quality of life on patients cannot be directly estimated and evaluated because they cannot communicate. But we can get information from similar conditions where patients have sustained severe brain injuries, but they remain able to respond. Such cases are the locked-in syndrome, different states of the locked-in syndrome. The locked-in syndrome characterizes patients in a rare situation where they are motorically disabled and they preserve a mode of communication which is classically nonverbal. Usually it happens with the blinking of the eyes for yes-no code of communication. We asked these patients, thus they were members of the Association of the Locked-in Syndrome in Paris, what was the best period of their life and what was the worst period of their life, and to give us an estimation of how they've been during the last 2 weeks. So most possibly, most of us, if we imagine ourselves in this situation, we would think that we would lead a very bad quality of life. But patients, the majority of them, they said they professed a quite good satisfactory quality of life, in contrast with a small minority that they said that they were not enjoying their lives at the moment. We also checked how the continuity of self-image looked like in the locked-in syndrome. So here we see the number of respondents in terms of locked-in syndrome patients, the healthy people. So healthy people, when they imagine themselves sustaining such a severe change in their lives, they said that myself would be a totally different thing after the accident. I would be a different person. In comparison to what locked-in syndrome patients say, that actually I am the same person. I just now have different capacities to calibrate my life and find meaning. And most recently, we showed that the interpersonal attitudes impact the experienced self-personhood. So if we see here the prevalence in terms of the number of respondents about the lack of communication, objectification and of attitudes, and lack of consideration, these are what they respond. The locked-in syndrome patients responded as regards the relationship with the others. So it happened, for example, that people would talk about them while being in the same room as if they were not there. What I want to show with all these studies is that our bodies and the way we relate to the world with our bodies play a role in the perceived personhood, selfhood, and essentially consciousness. So going from strictly neurocentric brain studies toward brain-body interactions to consciousness, for me, is the next logical step. And this is what I'm currently pursuing with my lab in the University of Liège. Just to give you an indication of how we can integrate bodily signals, somatic markers in the study of consciousness, is the study we did in Paris during my postdoc years, where we used an auditory audible paradigm as prompting cognitive processes, while checking how the heart was reacting to these audible moments. So here we can see the heart. This is the R to R interval. And here we were studying how the heartbeat was changing after hearing the audible sound of the audible paradigm. Let me play to you how the audible paradigm sounded like. You realize that this fifth sound in the last part of series was different. And this difference in expectation, we found that elicited different reactions of the cardiac cycle phase. So we found that the cardiac cycle phase accelerated only the minimally conscious state patients as compared to unresponsive, which suggests that the people were somehow, these patients would somehow translate this expectation that we could detect in the heart activity, cardiac activity. And this is to show that if we combine the ECG, the electrocardiography, with EEG, electroencephalography, and we check how these two can separate patients between MCS and unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, we found that the combination, especially when using the cognitive paradigms, was higher in the discrimination ability as when considering just the cardiac activity alone or the EEG alone. And in that case, somatic markers carry independent information about the level of consciousness. This is what we're doing in my lab nowadays. We study these somatic reactions to different perturbations, and we're trying to see how these account for the different aspects of cognition and even consciousness. For example, here I show you how we used the electrocardiography, EOG, how we measure it here. We see it at baseline and how it looked like in terms of amplitude and duration during caloric irrigation. Caloric irrigation is when we put very warm water in the ears, or very cold water, depending. Here we use warm water, and then we study how the obtained nystagmus look like. So we study these very small um, movements in response to how these modulate and adjust and modify after giving specific tasks, like try to stop the nystagmus or do not do anything. And the premise is that the brain and the body together, when they're studied, they can give us more complete picture of the state of consciousness than each of them in isolation. So to conclude, I would like to remind you that consciousness is a very complicated field of research, because it rests on this very subjective, intimate experience, subjective experience of the world. And I hope that so far I showed you how consciousness is realized by a brain which is intrinsically organized, which is characterized by complexity and dynamic flexibility. And in the end, I wanted to make the claim that consciousness can be well studied from brain-body interactions, in the end, to give us a better picture of what it is. Because in the end, my understanding, it is not necessarily a phenomenon that it absolutely exists. It's a matter of collective consensus. We all have to agree on what we mean when we study consciousness. And in that case, it still carries many ongoing debates, not only about its nature, but also its applications. So how consciousness research is going to evolve, it's an interesting question. And I'm here to study it in the years to follow. I'm very happy to host any of you to come and explore it together. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to write to me. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you once again for hosting me in your series of talks, and I really wish that I will meet in person one day and exchange hugs and expand our experience, conscious experience together in person. Thank you. Bye bye.